Today, it's my pleasure to be joined by Seselja, the former senator for the ACT and an ex-minister in the Morrison government. I'd like to start off today by talking to you about what's been going on in Venezuela. And my first question is, what were you thinking when you saw the news alert going, Trump's kidnapped Maduro?
Yeah, well, g'day. Great to be with you, Anthony. And look, it was somewhat of a shock, although I think we had sort of seen it coming in some of the other actions of the Trump administration, particularly in their region. We'd obviously seen the military action that they'd taken against some of those drug cartels, the transfer of drugs and the like, with strikes on those. So that was obviously a pretty muscular posture that the Trump administration is taking in its hemisphere, in its region, particularly there in Central and South America. But obviously it was a bit of a surprise to see the action against Maduro and the way that it was done. It was obviously a very effective military campaign. Some of the early language from President Trump, I think, probably didn't help him with selling the issue to the American public. I think if you look at particularly the MAGA base, they are not particularly interested in the US getting into foreign entanglements, but taking some action if it's seen as a defensive posture. And obviously Maduro and that regime are implicated with the drug trade. And obviously that is a big concern to Americans across the political spectrum, across the board. And so, you can understand, I guess, some of the politics. I don't think some of the language was helpful, but it was obviously effectively executed. And now it's going to be a question of, what happens obviously with the trial, but also what happens with the regime going forward, which appears at this stage to be relatively intact, despite Maduro being.
So we heard from the Trump administration that a large reason of why they were doing this was essentially law enforcement. I believe that's how Rubio framed it. But what I want to know is, you've been involved on the global stage, global politics. What do you think this operation was really about? Was it about law enforcement, as Trump said, or was it about oil, as a lot of protesters have been saying recently?
Well, it's probably about all of the above to some degree. It certainly would be, at least in part, about protecting America's interests, or what is seen to be America's interests, in regard to stopping the drug trade or slowing it down. Obviously, you probably never stop it, but attacking the drug trade. I think with Maduro and the socialization of a lot of the oil assets and the like, that has caused concern to the United States. And there is an ongoing issue with some of the US companies that invested in some of those oil assets and whether or not they were fairly treated. So there's a question of property rights, which the Trump administration, there would be a lot of voices into the Trump administration about, taking care of business in that regard. And so oil in that broader context, I think absolutely. And then there's a question of what kind of a message is it sending to some of the United States' adversaries, particularly China and Russia, in regard to them coming into the US's region in Central and South America, and obviously the relationship they've had with that Venezuelan regime. So I think that was an important subtext. And so I think to that degree, it is sending a bit of a message to some of those US adversaries that the United States isn't going to just be taken for granted. We've seen, this isn't unique to Trump. We have seen that some of these types of operations happen in the past. And obviously we saw, I think I was under George Bush Sr., we saw issues in Panama and the like. So we see these issues emerge from time to time. I think that there is a broader tolerance, certainly amongst the Trump base, if it's seen to be directly in the United States' interest. But when they talk about, when they use language such as, we're going to run Venezuela, that probably doesn't help sell that, although we saw that walked back very quickly, and I think particularly by Marco Rubio. And so I don't think that some of those early statements, and this is the beauty, if you like, of Trump, or the drawback of Trump, depending on how you look at it. He will often say things which he doesn't necessarily want to be taken literally, and they're often for effect. And so you need to see the overall policies over a period of time before you judge it, rather than judging him on, a particular statement he's made at a particular time.
We talked about Donald Trump sending a message to Russia, China, their foreign adversaries. But the other clear message that I think got sent is that the United States is no longer following the rules-based order, which has been broadly followed by the West since the fall of the Soviet Union. So what I want to know from you is, how does the Trump's actions now, kind of basically abandoning international law, how does that affect the global rules-based order? And more broadly, what does this mean for Australia's foreign policy? Does this mean in regions such as the Pacific, where we're trying to counter Chinese influence, is this sending us a green light to be more aggressive with the kinds of foreign policy actions we start to take?
Well, possibly. I mean, I think there's a couple of things when we look at it. As I said, this is not the first time the US has taken action like this. And even if you go back to, say, Iraq in '03, which I think we would all acknowledge has had significant problems in the way that it was executed, there was the same sort of questions around whether international law in fact authorised it. Yes, there was UN Security Council resolutions and the like, but there was a large body of opinion suggesting that this was not authorised by international law or under international law, despite the US's arguments about, weapons of mass destruction and the like. I don't think we should be naive enough to think that the US's actions here are going to change the way that China or Russia or others operate. We've obviously already seen that with Russia and Ukraine. I've heard some commentators try and suggest that this would give more of a green light to China when it comes to Taiwan. I don't see that. I think if anything, the US having a muscular posture makes China pause more as it considers any sort of expansionist aspirations it might have. In our region, I think there will be some propaganda value perhaps for the Chinese government, but they don't need too much when it comes to that. They've used every means at their disposal to try and gain influence in our region. I think Australia needs to continue to grow its presence in the region. I think it needs to do that in conjunction with its allies. We see that from time to time. We see that in places like PNG in particular, and we see that when the US has a greater presence in terms of troop rotations and the like. In Australia, there's a number of ways that it does that, but I think that continuing presence of Australia and its allies, most particularly the US, will be, I think, the most important thing as we seek to deter China and their expansion into particularly the Pacific.
So just to put an analogous situation to you, Venezuela is obviously a security threat to the US, just as Cuba would be on their Monroe Doctrine. Australia doesn't currently have a similar sort of doctrine. Like, obviously, we want influence within the Pacific nations. We don't want Chinese military bases, but we don't see it as we don't frame it as an existential threat to our existence. If there were to be a Chinese military base, we're not putting out a policy like if the Chinese built a military base in Fiji for submarines, that where our natural foreign policy response would be to invade Fiji as the US might historically. But what I want to know, should Australia start to consider that kind of foreign policy tact, given how the US is going? So if we start to see a country in the Pacific Islands sign some sort of treaty that is jeopardizing our ability to protect our nation, is there an argument in this new modern world in which I guess countries seem to do whatever they want to, that we start to exert maximum pressure on these countries to abandon these deals with China? And if so, what does maximum pressure look like in your mind? Is it military intervention? Is it economic coercion? Is it things like saying we're not going to send our police forces to these nations to help out anymore? How do we kind of try and get the outcomes we want to see?
Yeah, well, this is what governments of all persuasions in Australia have been grappling with for some time, and we certainly grappled with it when we were in government. I think there's a number of different measures. I think some of the measures you've talked about clearly have to be part of the mix. I mean, we are, despite China's growing influence in the region, Australia is by far the biggest provider of assistance, of aid to our Pacific neighbours, bar none, really bigger than the rest of the world combined. So we shouldn't underestimate how big a player we are in our own backyard, and that's absolutely appropriate. I certainly am one who believes that a large and very substantial chunk of our overseas aid should be delivered in our region. I think most Australians agree with that. They agree with that because they do see, particularly our small Pacific Island neighbours, as part of our sort of extended family and our backyard. But they also know it's in Australia's interest to do it well. So yes, using that for leverage. I mean, I think that there can be a bit of naivety sometimes that comes out, sometimes expressed in the bureaucracy, that we hand over the aid, but we wouldn't want to sort of use that as leverage. I just don't think that that's real world. I think that, of course, we ask for something in return, and if we see our neighbours in that regard taking our very substantial support, whether it's in natural disaster relief, whether it's in education, whether it's security, patrol boats that we've delivered to those island nations, and then do deals, as we saw, and we'll get onto, I'm sure, with the Solomon Islands and the like, and do deals with China and play footsie in that way. There are levers we can pull. I think there's also other things we have going for us, which we probably underestimate. Some of the cultural links between Australia and Pacific Island nations are very, very strong, and the average citizen would feel much closer to Australia than certainly to the Chinese communist regime, and we shouldn't underestimate that. Now, sometimes I think the elites in those countries will ignore what their people would want, but that pressure can build over time as well. And the cultural links we have, the economic links we have with worker programs and the like, cultural links we have sporting connections, in religion. This is a very Christian region of the Pacific, and they take their faith very seriously, and the links we have with churches and the like are very significant as well. It's not something that can easily be replicated by the Chinese government. And so we need to see where our strengths are. I don't think we'll have a Monroe-type doctrine. I don't think that's the way we're going to do foreign policy, but you can be muscular in different ways, and you can certainly assert your interests, and I think that's what Australia should seek to do, no matter who's in government. I think that's what Australia should be doing, because ultimately it's about protecting our interests, our region, and we know, the consequences, obviously, over time of having, adversaries much closer to Australia, and particularly if their military were to get access in that way.
So the next thing I'd like to talk to you about today is Iran. So we've recently been seeing large-scale protests, unprecedented protests since the 1979 revolution in that country. What I found interesting is silence, I think. We haven't heard much from Menzies, and we haven't heard much from people on the streets. Now, this isn't unprecedented. People don't comment a lot of times on large-scale events that happen in the world. But why I thought it was interesting is we've been having a lot of protests about Palestine, regardless of what the audience's thoughts are upon the Israel-Palestine conflict. I find it interesting that we're seeing 2,000 people were slaughtered just the other day, protesting for freedoms, protesting for women to be able to go outside without having to wear a hijab, to go outside without a male guardian, protesting for basic civil liberties. And we're seeing a lot of silence from both Australian citizens and the Australian government. Do you think there is a moral obligation, I would say, upon both the government and upon broader social movements that advocate for civil liberties to start speaking up in support of what's going on over there?
Well, I think moral obligation is an interesting term. I think that Australians are free to care about whatever issues that they care about, and we'll all have different links to different parts of the world. It might be where our forebears have come from. It might be a place we've visited. It might be where we have friends and family, all of those things. I think, though, your point about the silence is a very interesting one. And I'd be interested in your thoughts on what you're seeing on university campuses in regard to that, because obviously issues around Palestine are very loud and are very well ventilated in Australia, and the debate about what should happen there, and particularly the Israeli government's response to October 7 and what we've been seeing over those last couple of years has legitimately been a topic of debate, absolutely. But Iran, with its very substantial population, with being a real powerhouse in the Middle East, a theocratic regime that's cracking down on its people. I think that the scenes coming out of Iran are, tragic, and obviously we're not seeing the most of it because so much of it has been suppressed. So we're just hearing bits and pieces and seeing the occasional bits of very concerning and very disturbing footage. So, yeah, it's not that individuals have a moral obligation to care about every conflict or every difficulty, because unfortunately there is a lot of conflict and a lot of hardship in many parts of the world, and we often probably don't hear about most of it. But it probably does stand out, given the significance of Iran in the region, it's a question for some of those activists as to why they don't see that this is an important thing to talk about. But I'm interested in what you're seeing on university campuses, because
Mhm.
obviously university campuses, we see a lot of debate, a lot of protest about all sorts of issues, and Palestine being one of them. What are you seeing?
Well, to be fair to activists, I think most of universities in Australia are currently out, so there's not the opportunity to
But
do
some of these
widespread
issues aren't that
organization.
new either, to be
No,
fair.
what obviously Palestine has had a lot of activism. I've just found it interesting that we've had a lot of actors who have been very vocal about people getting killed in Palestine and the such, but the silence upon people who are fighting for their literal freedom. I just found that interesting, and I'm wondering just if people are making arguments about how what's going on in Palestine is really bad because people are getting killed, people's freedoms are getting torn away. I guess more so to the point, if you're going to make those moral claims, it seems to me that you should also be supporting movements for freedom in other countries and not staying silent upon them, especially when Iran is a major player in what's been going on in that region. And if that regime were to fall, I imagine that would be Hamas's backing basically gone, would it?
Well, look, obviously Iran has been, the biggest state sponsor of terrorism. I think there's no doubt in the region, and they have been on the back foot in recent months. There's no doubt about it. It would be a seismic shift if that regime were to fall. Now, I don't think there's any guarantees that that regime is about to fall. It's obviously under a fair bit of pressure. But when we talk about the silence, I think we can't go unremarked. The BBC in particular and other media outlets that really for a long time weren't covering much of it. The ABC, there'd be a similar criticism. I've started to notice the ABC in recent days has upped its coverage, and maybe that's in part response to some of that criticism about silence. But taking a step back from those issues, which I think are important, it would be an absolutely seismic shift if this regime were to fall. It's obviously been a very oppressive regime. Millions, tens of millions of people in Iran have been oppressed by this regime over a long period of time. I think for the good of the world, I think certainly for the good of the Iranian people, it would be great to see this regime gone. I'm cautiously optimistic, but I think there's a long way to go. And, I think the US response is interesting. Trump has obviously made a lot of statements about it in support of the protesters. That's positive, but will they back it up? If they back it up, will it be limited airstrikes and the like? And then there's that question again of foreign entanglement for the United
Mm.
States. How prepared are they to get involved? I don't think there's a great appetite in the United States for a long-term involvement in Iran. So what are you leaving there? There's always that question. Now, it's hard to imagine it's going to be much worse than a theocratic regime that we've seen in Iran. But as we've seen in other places like Libya and Iraq, you can get rid of a regime that's very bad and that we see as very bad, and sometimes what replaces it can be even worse. So there needs to be obviously a lot more thought before the US goes in, and in terms of what that response looks like, if indeed there is any sort of military response that comes from the United States.
If the Americans send in troops to Iran, is Australia following tow? Well, I'll phrase this in two ways. Do you think it's likely that the Albanese government would send troops in with a task force with the Americans if they did decide to intervene there? And the second part of the question is, do you think Australia should be intervening in Iran if the Americans decided to do so too?
Uh, my my answer would be no. I don't think Australia will. And I don't think Australia should at this stage. We have limited defence capability. We have obviously very highly trained and skilled Defence Force personnel who have acquitted themselves in an extraordinary manner in all sorts of theatres. But we have a relatively small military by world standards. We have our own issues in the Pacific. Obviously, the US alliance is critically important to us. But I would take a step back and say, well, should the US be putting troops on the ground? And I would say no at this stage. I think that ultimately individual nations largely should be dealing with their own issues around regime change. And when we've seen external powers like the US and others come in with regime change imposed from outside, I don't think it's ended well most of the time. And as I say, and that's happened under Republican administrations, some happened under Democrat administrations. It's happened, in Iraq, where we saw, a big build up and then going in and putting troops on the ground and all the chaos that we saw after that. But we've also seen it with just complete vacuum in Libya, where, I think under Obama, we saw this situation where it was sort of in a little bit happy to knock the regime over, but not really get their hands dirty, but it still left a massive vacuum in that area as well, which I think it's still recovering from. So I think the big thing to remember is you just don't know what the result of these kind of interventions will be. You don't know how long you'll be drawn in. You don't know how much blood and treasure, whether it's the United States or anyone else, would have to give up in order to do this. And so you'd be asking the question, if I was a US citizen, I'd be asking the question, well, why would we be going into Iran? Do you have a contrary view?
Well, I think the whole debate, and it's kind of interesting, is when we think as Western nations, obviously large militaries, very influential, a lot of power to change the governments of other countries. The question I think a lot of people have been grappling with since the fall of the Soviet Union, or rather governments have been grappling with, is when is a situation so bad in a nation that civil liberties are so exploited, the risk of terrorism is so bad that it imposes an obligation upon a government to intervene in another country. So, for example, in Rwanda, I think the global West clearly got that wrong. They decided not to intervene, and we saw one of the most horrendous genocides in history. We saw a situation in Somalia, Black Hawk Down. A lot of people say, well, the US chose to intervene there. That was a mistake. And then we saw something like Afghanistan, where clearly the US needed to get involved there to purge the country of Al-Qaeda. But then the question was, when was the right time to pull out? Was there ever a right time to pull out, given, the regime over there is pretty horrendous, what they're doing. So I think it's a very difficult question, because even though the intentions might be good, like protecting people's basic human rights, sometimes an intervention can result in consequences that are infinitely worse than if you hadn't even intervened in the first place.
I think without a doubt. And I think it's the challenges of empire, isn't it? I mean, the United States is an empire, let's face it. It's the most powerful nation on earth. It has been at least since World War II and perhaps well before that. But empires always struggle with these questions. The US overwhelmingly, I think, has been a force for good. If you look at some of the alternative empires that we could have, that doesn't mean they've always gotten it right. That doesn't mean they've always only done good in the world. No, only a very naive person would claim that, I think. But this is the challenge, and I get the feeling, as an observer of the United States and as an observer of US politics, that there is very limited appetite from the American people at the moment for further entanglement. They've seen a lot of their young men and women killed or maimed or damaged in one form or another by involvement in Afghanistan and Iraq. You could argue, I think, quite a distinction between Afghanistan and Iraq and the merits of the involvement from the United States and Australia and other allies. But I sense a real tiredness and a real lack of appetite. And I think that's going to colour the response of any president in the United States, be they Republican or Democrat, and I think that'll be the case for some time. But will they act to try and protect their interests? I think they will. And we see that, we've talked about some of the areas closest to them. Iran is a different question. We saw very limited strikes there, but if you were to go beyond that, how far beyond that do you go, and what are the consequences? I would be urging caution.
So there's a lot of interesting stuff that's happening in the world right now, both at home, massive events, and internationally. But I'd like to turn back the clock a little bit and explore your involvement in politics and what inspired you to get involved. So I'm aware your parents were originally from Yugoslavia. That's how they immigrated to Australia. And I'm interested whether that background of coming from an oppressive communist regime, whether that helped influence some of the values you held today and other things from your upbringing that led you towards deciding to run for the Liberal Party in the Australian Capital Territory.
Places.
Of all places.
Look, I think it's a pretty important part of my political backstory, certainly, is where my family comes from and some of what they experienced under a Yugoslav communist regime. So both my parents are Croatian and grew up post World War II, both born just after World War II, I think 1947, 48. And not long after that and so obviously you had the regime of Tito, who was the sort of Yugoslav dictator running Yugoslavia, and Croatia was part of that sort of federation, which, was sort of effectively forced on people. There were some Croatians who wanted, but many who didn't. And we saw, this bringing together of a number of different cultures into Yugoslavia, and then a communist dictatorship after World War II, and all of the oppression that goes with that you'd expect. And my family sort of saw a bit of the sharp end of that. So my uncle, Stipan, was imprisoned by the communist regime in the 1950s for a number of years. He was a seminarian at the time, studying to be a priest, and eventually did become a priest and came out to Australia, lived almost to the ripe old age of 90 and had a great life, but spent several years in a Yugoslav prison for trumped up political charges. He was effectively imprisoned for being outspoken in support of a high profile cleric, Cardinal Stepinac. So freedom of religion, freedom of speech, political freedoms, all of those things, along with economic freedoms that were robbed of people in communist regimes. And that was a big part of the reason why my family came to Australia. In fact, number two uncle, the second oldest boy, left Yugoslavia, Croatia at the time, around about the time that my other uncle was still in prison. It was sort of around that time in 1958 when he was coming towards the end of his time there. But you can imagine how that would have coloured their view of the world, that, they can see their brother imprisoned for his political and religious perspective, something that's horrific to us. And if you think what it would be like to languish in that prison, that very much, I think, coloured our conversations growing up about politics, about right and wrong, about the greatness of Australia and the democratic process, and what how grateful, I suppose, my family was, including my grandparents who came to Australia, how grateful they were for what they had here in this country, the freedom that was being denied them in their homeland. And I still loved where they'd come from. You don't just lose that connection overnight. They held on to their language, their culture, but they became very much Australian. And so that part of the story is important in my worldview. One, strongly, obviously, anti-communist, pro-democracy, pro-political freedoms, religious freedoms, freedom of speech, economic freedoms, which is a really important part of it that gets denied you. I think in Australia we have those freedoms, but they're not without challenges, are they? And we see attacks on freedom of speech. We see attacks on economic freedom. We see other attacks on freedom. So that's an ongoing fight. And it caused me to reflect when I think about my uncle's experience, where he actually had the opportunity. He didn't have to serve the time he did. He could have recanted his views, which is what they would have wanted, could have recanted his faith, and he would have had a much easier time of it, but he refused. And so I think about that in the context of battles and challenges that we might face in politics when I was in politics, how we have it so much easier than some of my forebears had it, so much easier than people around the world these days have it. We talk about Iran. We talk about other countries where you don't have the freedoms that we take for granted in this country. So that's worth celebrating, what we have here. It's worth protecting, fighting to protect. And that was very much what led me to the Liberal Party. When I look at the core values of the Liberal Party, they very much align with those values. Economic freedom being at the heart of it, but so is religious freedom. That's in the Liberal Party's founding document. So is freedom of speech. So is mention of the family, and Menzies was a great proponent of the family as being the centre of society. It's not, I think we sometimes, and I'm interested in your thoughts and a bit of a discussion about this, I think sometimes in the Liberal Party, we talk about the individual a lot, which is good, but we don't talk about the family as much as we used to, as that real building block of society where individuals are able to flourish much better than if the state is raising them or is interfering too much. And, I think we've lost a bit of that language in the way we talk. We definitely talk about individual freedom. Anyone who comes to a Liberal Party branch meeting and you ask them what they stand for, they'll say individual freedom, individual liberty, those sort of things. But we sometimes forget about the other aspects that built the Liberal Party and made it such a great political force in this country. And yes, it's on the back foot at the moment. But I'm hopeful. I'm cautiously optimistic that it'll be back as a continuing strong force and obviously back in government at some time, hopefully in the not too distant future.
Well, I think you bring up an interesting point there. And I think I'd also extend it to the Labour Party too. I think there's two sort of, this is a gross simplification, but I think there's two different worldviews that have kind of come out of the 80s, where you've got the individual side of both, the individualistic sides of both the Liberal and Labour parties, and then you've got the collectivist side. So your individuals on maybe a Liberal Party side would be your small government libertarians, is how I'd phrase that to simplify it. They were invigorated by Reagan's campaign, and that's kind of been the tradition that's dominated the Liberal Party since the Howard years, I would argue. And you've got the same thing probably on the Labour Party coming out of Hawke and Keating. They're very much privatisation, very much more an emphasis on individual liberty. And then you've got people who are more, I'd say, conservatives or traditionalists. I'd argue probably Tony Abbott's more to this side, at least nowadays, in promoting traditional values and things like that, and more of a collective society where we kind of work together to create a community to help each other. And I think that's a debate that seems to be rearing its head again within both the left and right of politics, is that individualism for many, I think, has we've come out of that era, and it's felt a little bit soulless, a bit commercial, I think. And I think people are starting to have that argument, well, do we need to start thinking about being collective, which is on the right side, it might be traditional values. On the left side, it might be things like socialism, more government as being the source of the collective instead of community, which might be more on the right side of politics. But I'd be interested on hearing your perspective on that. Particularly, we both come from immigrant families, so I think that definitely colors our perspective. Community tends to be quite important, but I'd be interested in hearing your perspectives on that.
Yeah, I mean, you make a number of really good points, and it's a caricature, right? It's a caricature to say the Liberal Party has traditionally just been about individualism and not about communities. I mean, that's rubbish, right? Like, if you look at when the Liberal Party was formed, all of those organisations that Menzies managed to, through his leadership, bring together, they were community organisations. They were not just individuals just living their libertarian lives. So there's always been an understanding of a much broader concept. I harp on about family because we've lost the ability to talk about it. And when we talk about the 2025 election, I think it's worth touching on that. We've lost some of the language, and I think the Liberal Party needs to recapture that. Let's look at the Howard government, for instance. John Howard was obviously very clearly someone who believed in economic liberalisation all throughout his time in public life, whether that was supporting some of the things that you refer to with Hawke and Keating, with whether it's tariffs or floating of the dollar and the like, but then also coming into government and, changes to the Reserve Bank, obviously things like GST, tax reform, which is maybe not, it's tax reform you could put into a number of different buckets as to what it means, but obviously he was into fiscal responsibility, balancing budgets, but he was also into good family policy and into supporting communities. It wasn't some sort of soulless individualism that you refer to. And I now have grown up kids, I have adult kids, I have a grandson now, and so you're always looking to the future. You're looking at the future of your kids and now my grandkids. And when I hear from people in their 20s now, young people, which is where a number of my kids are, I don't think anyone's ever been drawn to that caricature. And it's a caricature that the Liberal Party has sometimes allowed to be imposed on it when it's not really the truth of it. It's never been who we are, but sometimes there are elements of it probably who lean far more towards that. But I don't think many young people are drawn to that, but nor are they raving socialists either, and so we talk about our challenge with young voters, and it's no doubt it's there. It's always been there for the Liberal Party, let's be clear, and I think it's got harder in the last 10, 15, 20 years for a number of reasons. But young people, I don't think, are drawn to that. And I think also young people are looking at society and a number of the things that are sort of falling apart in society. And, there's a lot of unhappiness. There's, high rates of negative mental health. We see high suicide rates amongst young people. We see a bit of a sense of hopelessness. Liberal Party needs to always be a party of hope and a movement for hope and how we can help deliver things, not because we've got all the answers, because government never will have all the answers, but answering some of those fundamental questions. And those, many of those are questions of meaning too, right? And Liberal Party is not a religious party and never will be, but always has been founded broadly on that Judeo-Christian ethos. And that's obviously at the heart of where the Liberal parties come from. And we should never lose that, whilst also obviously continuing to be a party that's welcoming of all people of all faiths and of no faith indeed.
Well, I think this brings us on to an interesting point, which is talking about the future of the Liberal Party and its current state. So I think what you've been talking about is the thing that the Liberal Party needs to be selling an energetic message. It needs to be selling a message that has some sort of community feel to it, because I think the best way to get elected is to have a movement. Trump's shown that in 2024, 2016. Trump showed it in 2020 when a movement against him managed to get Joe Biden elected. I think we've seen this all across the world. So, and when I've been looking at the last elections, 2022, 2025, my big question each election has been not only what is the Labor Party selling, because I think they have this problem too, but a big problem is what is the Liberal Party selling? I looked at Peter Dutton. I had a lot of friends who, some of them were libertarians, some of them were a bit centre-right. They didn't actually vote for the Liberal Party because they were like, Peter Dutton's economic policy is actually just as bad in their minds, and they didn't know what was going to change. So my question is, why hasn't the Liberal Party, since, I guess, Turnbull really, come up with a new message to sell to the Australian voters of what's tangibly going to be different in Australia? And besides why they haven't done that, what do you think that message should be? How should they be selling it?
Well, I mean, I disagree with you on since Turnbull. I mean, I would think that the 2019 election was the last example where we had a very clear message, and the message was around economics largely. It was around the danger of what was being offered by the Labor Party,
But that's
their taxation.
to be
And feel free to counter this, but that also spoke to a positive about what we were for. We were for lower taxes. We were for aspiration. We were for home ownership. And I think that was a positive unifying thing for the Liberal Party. I think we can learn a lot from it. But sorry, you wanted to interject?
Yeah, the only point I would put to that is I agree. They did have a message, but the message was more so counter to what the Labor Party was doing, instead of thinking about some systematic change that the Liberal Party was going to do in government. Now, I understand you might argue, well, Australia isn't broke, let's not fix it kind of thing, so maybe we shouldn't just be recklessly putting up a new policy. But I just wonder, towards young people, getting them motivated into politics, having some sort of substantive change, like this is how your life is going to be different, not how it's going to, not just saying we're going to not do what the Labor Party is doing, what's something new that we're going to advance as a party. And
that's particularly important for oppositions, obviously, because oppositions are arguing for change. Governments, to some degree, arguing for more of the same, with some amendments here and there, and often arguing against. And let's face it, that's the nature of campaigns. They tend to sharpen and crystallise into very simple issues. Now, we would like it, many of us who get into the depths of policy would like it if we could have a detailed policy debate with every Australian. Most people don't engage at that level, so we do end up with a simplified message, but the most effective political messages speak to a deeper truth. And so, when Tony Abbott in 2013 had simple slogans, which he was later criticised for, they still spoke to deeper issues. So Stop the Boats might sound like a very simple slogan, but it speaks to national sovereignty, obviously, which people felt was being given up by the former Labor government. If you have an open borders policy, if you allow people to come in unlawfully, then you've lost sovereignty. So Stop the Boats encapsulates what is a really important policy. Axe the tax, again, talks to smaller government, lower taxes, more economic freedom, and those sort of things. So if I were to look forward then, or back, but forward from 2019 to 2022, and let's more recently a 2025 election, well, what was the Liberal Party message? I think that's fundamentally, I don't think many people could tell you what the Liberal Party message was, because it was not clear. I was on the ground in many marginal seats. Obviously, I observe it very closely, but got to speak to a lot of candidates and volunteers and party members and others and sitting members at the time, and some of whom lost their seats. We didn't have a clear message. And there were a number of factors that led to us not having a clear message. And, ultimately, we needed to and wanted to make that election about the Labor Party and cost of living and the economic challenges that people were facing. What happened, in fact, was that the Labor Party successfully turned it into a referendum on whether the Liberal Party was ready. And it didn't look ready, to be perfectly honest, during that campaign. And that was partly because of the lack of policy development, or at least not releasing those and arguing for those policies. And, I think this is worth pausing on and reflecting on some of these issues, because I think there's still some important lessons. I know we're a little way down the track and it's been sort of done to death in terms of what some of these issues are. But, we lost the battle on some key issues, and ultimately where things were in January, February of 2025, where we were sitting in front, very quickly turned into a debacle because we lost the argument over what the question would be at the election.
I think a useful way to analyze this issue is by looking at the two major threats to the Liberal Party. I guess the existential threats to the Liberal Party are One Nation and the Teal movement. I think Labor Party always is. That's more of a simple discussion. It's like, well, you have a better policy set than the Labor Party, and both parties kind of compete for the centre ground. So I think there's no point discussing that for today, but I would like to get your thoughts firstly on what do you think about the rise of One Nation, which in a recent poll on primary votes, they're at the same level as the Liberal Party. On two-party preferred, they actually performed better than the Liberal Party against the Labor Party. You could call this a fluke, but whatever it is, that's pretty scary polling data if you were a Liberal Party strategist.
Yeah, well, a couple of things. And I don't want to downplay that threat at all. I think that poll at this stage appears to be an outlier, but there is unmistakably a trend at the moment where the Liberal vote is lower and the One Nation vote is higher. I don't think there's any doubt about that. The extent of that shift at the moment, I think, is very much up in the air, but I think it would be concerning anyone in the Liberal Party. Why is that the case? Look, there's a number of reasons. And I think whilst the Teal threat and the One Nation threat are very different, some of the answer to it is still similar, because getting the fundamentals right of a political movement is the first thing you've got to do. Before you start chasing the threats to your left and your right, you actually need to own who you are, stand up for who you are, articulate your values, articulate your policies, and sell them to the Australian people in a really effective way. And if you do that, you get a lot of people who could be a little bit on the left or a little bit on the right coming back because they see strength, they see conviction, they see policies that make sense and will make their lives better or will make their families' lives better. So when we get into the game of chasing the Teals or chasing One Nation on particular issues, I think we can lose, just as the Labor Party gets into trouble when they chase the Greens too much, because the Greens are eating into their primary vote. Different issues because of preference flow, but still similar challenges in terms of what the Labor Party has dealt with in recent times, and now the Liberal Party is very much dealing with in terms of eating into its primary vote. If I were to hazard a guess on One Nation, I'd be very interested in your views, particularly your demographic. I think young men may be drawn to the One Nation at the moment, young conservative men. I think that, and I've seen some polling data that suggests that amongst some young men, and when I say young men, I'm talking really almost up to my age, almost up to Gen X. So I wouldn't consider myself young anymore at 48, but certainly if we look at those demographics right through from the 20s into the 40s, where you're going from being single to often having a family in that period of time. Work is important. I'm certainly seeing evidence anecdotally in some of the data. Now, why exactly that is, I think I'd offer some views. I don't have all the answers. I think that certainly the Liberal Party's weakness at the moment creates a bit of a vacuum. I think minor parties can be clearer and more definitive on issues because they don't have to knit together different constituencies. They can very much target different constituencies. And this goes to the challenge on both sides, whether it's the Teals or One Nation, is a very fragmented market, very fragmented nation in many ways. But getting those fundamentals right is the first step. It's not going to be all of the answer, because there's going to be a lot of different policies and a lot of different things that the Liberal Party has to articulate in order to bring some of those people home. But getting your fundamentals right is important. And one thing we can learn from the Teals is, whilst some of it is manufactured, there is an element of grassroots connection, which we have to acknowledge. And the Liberal Party has that, but I don't think that all of our divisions in the way that they operate allow our grassroots supporters to get involved or encourage our grassroots supporters to get involved. In fact, I see evidence from time to time in some of our larger divisions that there is active efforts to stop Liberal Party supporters from actually becoming members of the party and becoming part of a movement. That would be a very important first step, is to ensure that we are genuinely a mass movement of people, because that brings with it all sorts of benefits. It brings energy, it brings volunteers, it brings finances, and it brings great ideas, and it brings a connection to communities that nothing else, that having really clever people with, lots of polling data simply can't replicate.
So I think that's an interesting answer to the question. And it's something I definitely agree with from what I've seen just walking through life, is that a large problem for the Liberal Party is the inability to articulate and then defend what they stand for, why they exist. And I think that would definitely explain why a party like One Nation could fill a void on the right, because they're a party that I think most people tend to know what they stand for. And most people definitely would agree that they furiously defend what they stand for. So maybe if the Liberal Party can do more of that, they might see better outcomes in future elections instead of just trying to chase people. I think the second a political party starts to chase their opponents, they're already on the back foot, aren't they? Because they're not presenting something new. They're not on their attack. They're just defending. And I think it was quite startling to see the 2025 campaign turn into Liberals defending territory when they're facing an incumbent government. That doesn't happen often. So, which was why it was quite a remarkable election. I guess I'd like to move on to them.
Can I comment on that? Just, I think, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but I think younger people in Australia very much value authenticity, and they can tell when someone's not authentic, and so they'll be drawn to authenticity, and it'll be left and right. They'll be drawn to it, and they're going to be not as tied to political parties as they once were, as maybe their parents or their grandparents were. So I think that's some of the new reality. And if you look at that election campaign, I think you're absolutely right. We weren't able to articulate it. Policies were left till very late. So even where there were good policies, say on housing and the like, they barely rated a mention. We did this in the last 2022 and 2025. The policies on housing, some of those were released in one case in 2022. I think it was a week out. I think it might have been slightly earlier, but there hasn't been an adaptation to how much longer it takes to articulate a policy. People don't watch the news anymore. People don't all read the broadsheets like they used to. And so if you want to get the average punter to understand what you stand for and what your policy suites are, you need to have them out early. You need to articulate them over a long period of time, not in 33 days, over a period of months and years, where they are getting an idea of what you stand for, what you're going to do. And this issue of home ownership, if you look at young people and losing faith in the democratic process and losing faith in the capitalist system, well, this question of home ownership, which largely the failings have been driven by left-wing policies, in my opinion, whether it's green tape, whether it's red tape, whether it's the outrageous union deals that have pushed up labour costs, whether it's deliberately stifling land supply, this is hurting a whole generation of Australians. And if we can articulate that and be on their side genuinely and pick some fights, whether it's the big super funds or whatever, I tell you what, that'll cut through. And I'll tell you what, a lot of young people will be drawn to that, and they will look at a leader who articulates that with passion and with great ideas, and they'll be drawn to that. And that's what fundamentally hasn't changed about politics. No matter how much demographics change, that has not changed. People are drawn to strong leaders, they're drawn to honest and articulate leaders, and they're drawn to good policies that make their lives better. And if we do all of those things, then left and right, you will draw people back, I've got no doubt.
Well, something I think voters are also drawn towards is a sense of stability within government. If we've looked at what's been happening in Victoria recently, they've been in opposition since the last election for another, I think it's 4 years is the state cycle, yet they've had three leaders. That's clearly not stability. My question is, why is the Liberal Party so open with factional battles, with personality battles? Why is this becoming such an issue since is when we had this vicious factionalism is really ramping up? What's causing that? How can the party solve it, or at least hide it like the Labor Party, like the Labor Party does? What are your thoughts on this?
It's a good point. I think the back end of your question is that obviously the Labor Party has its factional battles constantly and they're vicious. We know that most of the time. They don't break out into the public. We saw occasionally, and we saw at the back end of the Rudd-Gillard years that they did, and it hurt them very badly. And some of our people didn't learn that lesson. They came in and played out those factional battles publicly and did leadership change and all of that. So I think the first point you make is a very sensible one, is there's going to be vigorous debate. There's going to be factions within political parties. Anyone who pretends otherwise is selling you a story. How do you manage those? It does take good leadership. Building a culture where you can agree to disagree internally, but you come together on the big issues and you're not constantly playing these things out in public. I've had a view. This is not a popular view, but I had a view that I formed while I was in federal parliament. I saw some of our leadership changes and the messiness of that. And the Liberal Party doesn't have. We like to think of ourselves as much more democratic than the Labor Party, right? We don't have those factions like the Labor Party, and they name their factions, they formalise them, and we can criticise that or whatever, and we say that's very unliberal. But actually, what it leads to ultimately is there's not a lot of internal democracy in a party room. That's what people don't realise is it's rare that, say, policies that come to party room, they don't get voted on most of the time. I'm aware of it happening only on a very small handful of occasions in the last 15 or 20 years. We saw it on climate change. We saw it on, I think, the ETS when we were in opposition back in the Rudd-Gillard years, and we saw changes of leadership around that. We saw it on same-sex marriage as an internal vote when we were in government, and there may have been one or two other times since. But it is an exceedingly rare to vote on policy. So how's that get expressed? It gets expressed by changing the leader sometimes. So if you're frustrated and you're on the backbench and you're not being heard, then eventually the pressure builds and we see leadership under pressure. I think there are probably better ways, more democratic ways we could do things internally.
A pressure release valve is what they need, essentially.
Yeah, and having a little bit of internal democracy where we sometimes recognise, you know what, we do have sort of a more moderate left flank and we do have a more conservative right flank and we do have people who are somewhere in the middle and all of that. Of course, because we represent different parts of the community, we represent different traditions. We're not a minor party, we're a party of government, so we're going to have to reflect people in the cities and the outer suburbs and people in the regions and people in remote areas and all of that, and people who have very different worldviews, but we knit that coalition together. It's not easy, but we could start with our party rooms perhaps being a little more democratic and recognising that those differences will be there, but let's play them out a little more behind closed doors before we go and have a fight publicly.
Well, I think this is the problem for the Liberal Party. You just brought it up there that the party is diverse, represents many different groups, has a left flank. I think why the Liberal Party is partly so much strife right now is observing that they have one disadvantage that the Labor Party doesn't have. The Labor Party can kind of be somewhat uniform on social policy. I know the premiers tend to be a little bit more right-wing than their federal counterparts. But the Liberal Party is representing electorates that are socially progressive and then electorates that are socially conservative. And they somehow have to knit through both differences in some electorates are economically populist, some are fiscally conservative to an extent that I don't think the Labor Party currently has to deal with or hasn't had to reckon with yet. So I guess my question for you, and the last thing we'll talk about today on the Liberal Party explicitly, is do you think that the Liberal Party, the Menzies coalition of old, can hold anymore? Is it still feasible for the Liberal Party to be winning seats in the Vaucluse area on the North Shore, which is socially progressive, and holding those regional and rural seats, those seats on the Central Coast, which definitely have a different value set, both socially and even more importantly, economically, on things like protectionism. See, for example, the differences in Andrew Hastie's way, how he approaches economics to, say, fiscal conservatives in the New South Wales Liberal Party.
Yeah, well, look, it's a question that I don't think there's an easy answer to. I hope so. Whether it's going to be to that extent, like, you mentioned Vaucluse and the like, there may be some parts of the inner cities and the formerly Liberal areas which maybe never come back to the Liberal Party, but I don't think we should be writing off the whole thing. I think we also fall into the trap of slicing and dicing the electorate in the way that the media does, and it suits their narrative. And as you say, the Labor Party has an advantage because, and I think their biggest advantage is that the Greens will take a lot of that hard left flank, but return 85% of it back in preferences. So they can sort of afford to look a little more centrist because the Greens will just deliver those people back in preference. Whereas when we lose people to One Nation and others, we tend to not get anywhere near the number of preferences back. It tends to be more around the 60 to 65% mark. So that's obviously a big difference. But yes, and going back to that earlier answer, I think if you get the fundamentals right, you will draw a lot of Australians to you. We talk about migrant communities and whether they are, and whether more recent diasporas like Indians and Chinese are voting for the Liberal Party. Now, I think that, I don't know. I haven't seen a lot of data on that. We saw the big debate, and there was a false number put there about, I think it was 80% or some rubbish that was put out there about the Indian diaspora. That's complete horse crap. I mean, it's just not true. But we sometimes have got drawn into that debate. Indian Australians who are coming here are often very aspirational, very family oriented, very much into growing small business and enterprise. So they're an obvious target. And likewise with a lot of our Chinese diaspora and a lot of our other migrant groups. So they're very gettable when we're talking about the issues that those people care about. Now, that's not about playing ethnic politics. It's actually just about saying, well, this is what we stand for, and we will fight for these values. And a lot of those values, that will appeal to them. But you need to take the time to sell it. But will there be a shift? Has there been a shift around the world? I think there has. And I don't think we're immune from that outer suburbs and regions have become a little more polarised from inner city areas, and there is more of a clash sometimes of worldviews. But I think there are a lot of those seats that are gettable, and I think a lot of the working class seats that the Labor Party has taken for granted in the past will be gettable over time. But the Liberal Party has to have a genuine narrative to appeal to those people without sacrificing what we believe, because we still do believe in a free market system. It's not without limits. We're not libertarian economists in our broad worldview in the Liberal Party. Yes, there are some libertarians within our ranks, but we do believe in markets as working much better than centralised control. I think that, obviously, if we look historically, COVID is one of the areas where we lost a lot of support because it was a lot of centralised control. Even those of us who were pushing back very much against it, we were losing that battle. And certainly the Labor Party and a lot of their constituencies suffered a lot less during COVID than our constituencies did. And I think that's still an ongoing battle for us, is to win some of those people back.
So I think we've had a lot of discussion about the Liberal Party. I'd like to turn now to what was life like when you were a senator, when you were a minister? And I think it'll be very interesting to kind of hear what was the daily life of a senator? What kind of stuff did you get up to as a minister? And kind of learn, is life tough, or is it as easy as people say when they're like, I could do the job? Could the average Joe on the street do the job of a senator?
Well, look, it depends on the average Joe. It's a challenging job. I don't think there's any doubt about that. Now, people will look at it and say politicians are lazy and they're this and that. Look, I'm a critic of politicians. I'm now no longer a politician, so I have the luxury of being able to criticise what they do and some of the things they stand for. But I do respect the work they do, and having seen it internally, there is a lot to it. So obviously I was a senator, but represented the ACT as at the time, the only Liberal senator. And, so that constituency work was actually important. It was a little closer to some of that House of Reps work where I had to do that grassroots constituency work, because I would be getting a lot of representations from around my community, and obviously that was a big focus. And then looking to turn that into policy outcomes when you're in government and policy solutions for the community. So there's the electorate constituency work. There's the parliamentary work, which is a lot of your time and effort. Sometimes it feels a bit futile. You go in there and you have debates in the Senate. Most people aren't listening to it. And the only time, what you say in certain circumstances in the Senate gets noticed if you say something really stupid. And that's when it goes viral. The rest of the time, no one notices. But those sort of debates, committee work, policy within the Liberal Party work. Obviously, you're only in there, we're not independent, so we're there as representatives of our party. So you have to work those branches. You have to maintain support amongst that cohort and that group of people. Fundraising is important because you can't run election campaigns without money. So there's a lot to it in that. And obviously media, is a big part of it. We would spend a lot of time arguing on Sky News and the ABC and in other forums, which is great, which I enjoyed many aspects of that, but it's certainly not without its challenges, all of that. And then there's obviously, if you get higher on as like a ministerial role, it's a whole other world where you have that direct ministerial responsibility in various different portfolios. And it's a big responsibility because it matters what you do. And the decisions you make as a minister, can affect a lot of people and can affect the future of the country. And, I certainly took that very, very seriously when I was in there. And yeah, that's some of your day-to-day. But it could involve meeting with constituents, it could involve going into Parliament, having arguments, could involve media, it could involve party work, it could involve fundraising, and many days will involve the whole lot, as well as, the policy development that I talked about earlier.
So I've seen a little bit about what politicians get up to, watched a couple of those ABC documentaries, and you spend some pretty long hours in the Senate sometimes. I imagine there's a sense of camaraderie that you build with your colleagues, with people on the opposition bench. And I imagine you also encounter a lot of eccentric characters in the Senate. So I'd like to know kind of if you could speak to about the friendships that you built in the Senate, and maybe if you had any funny stories from some of your experiences.
Yeah, well, you do build some genuine friendships. And for me, it was in the Senate and in the House, mainly on our side of politics, but some of the friendships were across the aisle as well. And, some of those people you're in battle with, and, I was close to people like Michael Sukkar, who's no longer in the Parliament either, unfortunately, but Andrew Hastie, Angus Taylor, James Paterson, Matt O'Sullivan, Tony Passon, there's, and many, many others. Amanda Stoker, who's now in the Queensland Parliament, and Claire Chandler from Tasmania, and John O'Doniam, and so many good people who you get to know, Michaelia Cash from WA. So those people who you're sort of in the trenches with, and I'm sorry, there's many I've missed out who I consider very close friends as well. But you do build very good friendships because you're fighting for a cause. Those of us who genuinely see politics, and for me, formerly saw politics as a vocation, you very much are committed to the cause. You're committed to making the country a better place and to doing your bit, and you're committed to your party and it's prospering. And when you fight battles, whether you win or lose, and there were winning battles and there were plenty of losing battles, both in opposition and government. I was in opposition at an ACT level and in government at a federal level, so I sort of experienced both of them. Great friendships, had friendships across the aisle, people like Ed Husick and Raf Giacone and others who, you get to know quite well and you can connect with and have a drink with. Not quite the same because you're not fighting the same sort of battles together, but there's a healthy respect. And I think that's what you'd hope for. You get to do some fun things in politics. One of the fun things is you get to play soldier every now and again. I don't know if people are familiar with this. We have this thing called the ADF Parliamentary Exchange. So members of the Defence Force will come in for a week or two and work in parliamentary offices and learn about the political process, and we get to go and spend time in different settings. And I did it a few times, and I enjoyed it every time. And your respect for our military personnel just grows, and they humour us because they need to pretend that we're fitter than we are, and stronger than we are, and a better shot than we are, and all that sort of stuff. But they're very, very generous to us, nonetheless, even though we're complete amateurs. I remember going to Holsworthy with the 2nd Commando Regiment, and a lot of fun. And it was sometimes you did get a number of parliamentarians on this exchange. Sometimes it was quite small. A couple of times I did it was just me. In this case, it was Craig Kelly and I. And Craig is a friend, old friend. You know, he shifted parties when I was there and was with Palmer and all that. But I got a lot of respect for Craig. I like him. I don't agree with him on everything, obviously, but really like him as a human being. And we were doing this, couple of things I remember from it well. So we were with the 2nd Commando Regiment, and we were doing this mock night landing and we were in the Georges River. And so you'd have to go in and turn the boat's engines off, and you go fully clothed, and you'd sort of wade into as if you're doing a night landing in a sort of military operation. And when we were in there, Craig kept going on about bull sharks. And I'm like, what are you talking about bull sharks? Like, we're on Georges River, you know, we're fine. Like, we're just doing it. And he goes, no, look, there's a lot of bull sharks here. And I'm like, yeah, bullshit, you know, come on, mate. Anyway, then a week or two later, he sends me this picture from his local paper, the St. George Tribune, or I forget what it's called. My apologies to those in the area. But it had this picture of this massive bull shark they pulled out of the Georges River. I'm like, oh, shit.
Good you didn't know about that before.
Like, shit, Craig, you weren't lying. But it goes on, right? So Craig, like, I'm not super fit, but I'm probably a little bit fitter than Craig. We had to do this night march. And we were genuinely going through the night. You had night vision goggles and, you know, falling over. Craig fell over a couple of times, poor fella. And anyway, so I felt like I lost him after a while, and it was a long march. And then you do this mock firefight and stuff at the end. And we get there at the end, and he's then, you know, at the top of the hill. And I'm like, how did that happen? Like, what's going on here? And turns out later that the military had taken pity on him, and they'd put him on the back of the 4-wheeler. And while I was marching through the night, Craig was being escorted, getting the special treatment. So, like, and there's lots of fun stuff that happens, and politics is not mainly that. And if you went into it for the fun, well, you're probably in the wrong profession, because there are big downsides, you know, like, and I'm not here to have a whinge. This is just the truth of it. You know, there are big downsides, lots of time away from the family, lots of hours, you know, yes, the pay is pretty good compared to the average wage, no doubt about it. But you work a lot of hours for that. You're not working 8 hours a day. You're working in many cases 12, 14, 15, 16 hours and not switching off when you get home. And I know there's a lot of jobs out there that are much tougher than being a politician, don't get me wrong, but it's not an easy job. Like, that would be my argument to people, but it's a worthy job. And it is worth doing. And, you know, when there's young people thinking about it, yeah, there's a lot of downside. You'll get criticised a lot. You'll have some really, really bad days if you're in politics for a while. But you'll also do some amazing things and hopefully get to achieve some things that you're proud of, and you can look back. And most of us get kicked out at some point. Very few choose. I got kicked out by my electorate in 2022, and I know there's unfortunately too many Liberals who in 2022 and 2025 got kicked out by their electorates, and I hope a number of them will be back. But eventually, either your party, for most people, your party or the electorate calls time. And so whenever that ends, your time. And I had 18 years in politics between ACT and federal. So it was a longish run, but you want to be able to look back and be proud of your efforts and that you've really given your all.
Is it a relief to be out of the dogfight, or are you eager to jump right back in?
It wasn't at the time. I was devastated when I lost, absolutely devastated. I put in everything in that campaign. And look, Pocock was a tough opponent. He had a lot going for him, and he's proven himself tough since then, and he's increased his vote. But without going into all the details of that particular electorate, yeah, I missed it probably for at least a year. And I did try and come back through New South Wales. I put my hand up for Senate pre-selection there and fell short. I was, in the last 3, I think, but it was a tough battle. And Dave Sharma, who's, a friend of mine, I think, and someone who was successful in that, I'm really pleased for him. He's doing a great job, and I've got a lot of respect for Dave and others who are in the arena. And, and I told him that, very soon after he won, I gave him a genuine congratulations. So I did try and come back about a year later, but after that, I think I really had it out of my system. I think I don't ever see myself back in certainly an elected political life. I think I've really drawn a line under that. I think there's a time and a place for everyone. And as I say, 18 years in both arenas, both ACT politics and then federal politics, and as a leader in the ACT and as a minister at a federal level. Great privilege, but no, I wouldn't go back. And I'm having a great time with the family at the moment. Recently become a granddad a bit over a year ago, which is fantastic. I've got my kids grown up largely, not completely. I've got 5 kids and 4 of them are now adults, and just enjoying that next phase of life with them and with my beautiful bride, Ros. So, yeah, no, happy that I've given my all, mate, but no, won't be coming back.
So speaking of 18 years, very long. That's almost as long as I've been alive for. Crazy to think about it in those terms.
When you're my age, 18 years won't seem quite as long, trust me.
What would you say your proudest achievement was over those 18 years? And then on the flip side, what's your biggest regret or something that you look back upon and you're like, I'd do it differently if I had the chance?
Yeah, it's a good question. When it comes to successes, there are little successes that people don't see, which I was proud of. So one, in a ministerial level, I was an assistant minister for social services for a period of time and was really able to, at the time, I think unfortunately some of this may have been wound back, but move the dial forward on adoption in Australia, closely with the New South Wales coalition government at the time, who were doing really good things, to make it, because there are tens of thousands of kids languishing in foster care. This is a big issue around the nation. These are some of our most vulnerable kids, and really just pushing governments around the country to have policies that made it a bit easier for permanency, long-term orders, adoption, other things, so that these kids can have a proper, stable home. That was something I was very proud to push on. We did make some progress. Obviously, you look at it now and you think how much of it has been reversed, and that's unfortunately what happens sometimes. You can't always secure these legacies for as long as you would like, but it's something I felt very strongly about. And it's something I was able to push for. And by working with a big state government like New South Wales, I think we were able to get some really good things done. There are some local achievements, certainly. There's a highway that I'm particularly proud of. I got upgraded. It's called the Monero Highway in the ACT, and very pleasant. It's now finally being built. It took we first funded it from a federal level in 2018, and it's only really being built, proper way over the last 12 or 18 months. And that will be great for whole chunks of the ACT, but also bordering New South Wales, where there's a lot of population growth. So, you look at that and you say, oh, big deal. But actually, it did take a real fight, and the ACT government didn't want it, and we pushed them and were able to do that. And just finally, it was on things like housing, and some successes and many failures, unfortunately. But this is something from day one in politics in the ACT right through to the end of my time, I was always trying to push the dial to allow Australians to get a piece of Australia. This is fundamental to who we are. It's fundamental to family formation. It's fundamental to well-being. And ultimately, it's going to be fundamentally important for the future of the Liberal Party. If we can continue to give people a stake in the country, more and more Australians, that stake, we will be better placed as a political movement, because this is core to who we are. If less and less people have that opportunity, I think the Liberal Party is suffering from that and will continue to suffer. It's not the only issue, but I think it's an understated part of what's going on. Look, regrets. Obviously, I regret losing. Could I have done more? I think it's always better to leave your critics and others to launch the criticisms. Could I have been more? Could I have reached out to more parts of my party internally? Maybe. I thought I built a lot of friendships there, but there were probably other parts of the party where we were a little polarised, and maybe we didn't communicate as well as we should have. Maybe that's a regret, because I do see the value of that. And you mature and you learn from these things. So no, very much regret losing. But what I would say to any young person thinking about politics, for me, family is so much more important than politics. Now, I know that's maybe a cliche for some people, but I really tried to live it out. And that's why at the end of my time in politics, I'm not sitting there lamenting the fact that, my kids barely talk to me or whatever. I'm not going to go into all the different family issues people have. We're very, very well aware of them, but I'm very blessed to have a family I'm very close to. And that took a lot of effort in politics. And my wife is a saint, because she held things together, but it took effort on my part as well. And I would say, if you are thinking about going into politics, never forget the most fundamental things, because eventually you're going to be out, and your family is going to be ultimately what you look back on your deathbed on, and are grateful that you put in the time and the love and the commitment.
No, that's definitely important. I think maintaining a work-life balance is something I think is incredibly important, because at the end of the day, if you're just working for the the sake of working, just working to make money. I guess it's a little bit different in politics because you're affecting the lives of everyone. So maybe there's a greater purpose, but
which means you can justify it.
yeah, and
And
that's
it's a
dangerous,
trap.
isn't it?
It's
Yeah.
dangerous
No.
because you can convince yourself, well, and it is important work. Yeah, like don't get me wrong, it's really important work, but you've also got a responsibility to those closest to you as well, and you never want to forget about that. And unfortunately, a lot of marriages don't last in politics. A lot of families break down, and it's heartbreaking when you see it. So there's a lot of reasons for that, but to the extent you can have that focus, then it will be in everyone's interests, and you'll be very grateful.
So towards the end of the Morrison government, the Liberal years, you got appointed as Minister for International Development and the Pacific. We're also had some ABC articles about you, particularly regarding the Solomon Islands China Defense Treaty. I'd like to hear your reflections upon what exactly went down there, your efforts to prevent the treaty getting signed, and ultimately the Solomon Islands choosing to sign that treaty. And maybe looking back, was there another extent that the Australian government could have gone to try and prevent that treaty being signed?
Look, obviously I've reflected on it a lot. I think there are two aspects to it. There's the actual work to make sure we maintain Australia's position in the region, places like the Solomons and others, and counter some of that Chinese influence. And then there was the politics. And so I'll deal with the first before we deal with the politics of it. The actual efforts, is not about one individual thing. This agreement was probably coming for some time, but some of it is just downright corruption. There's no doubt about it, and that is a very hard thing for an Australian government to counter when there is just flat out corruption in some cases. And I think there were elements of that, and there are elements of that in Chinese influence in the Pacific and in other parts of the world, without a doubt. I don't think Australia is going to respond, nor should it respond with its own corruption, but that means you are a little bit hamstrung. So we need to be using, obviously, all the positive things we do, like aid, and we talked about the massive amount of aid that we do, cultural links and all of those other things. But we need to be, I think one lesson, and this has been a failure of governments over many years, is we haven't really asked enough in return for the extraordinary efforts we put into our region. So I think we should be a little more hard-nosed in that, and there should be a little more realpolitik in it. And I think that's criticism you could make in part of our government, but certainly the governments that went before us and, the various ministers over that time. I think when it came to the politics, it was obvious to me what was going to happen, and as it played out at the beginning of that election campaign. The fact that it played out in the election campaign was in part bad management from some within government. I think it was my view all the way through that there should have been, more senior representations made and seen to be made. Even if things were happening behind the scenes, the public needed to understand that the Prime Minister and or the Foreign Minister were directly engaging on that. And the visual of me being sent to go and be the guy, we were never going to stop it. Like by then the deal was done. Obviously we had to be seen to be making all efforts. It obviously would have been better if the Foreign Minister was getting on a plane or if the Prime Minister was.
Do you feel like you were left out, hung out to dry, so to speak, with that?
Well, I'm not going to use that language. Yeah. Other people probably would, but all I would say is it was pretty obvious to everyone. Certainly it was obvious to me well before we got to that point that it would have been better. That criticism that the Labor Party launched at the beginning of the election campaign was an obvious criticism they were going to launch. You didn't have to be too smart to figure out that was going to be what they were going to say. And given, I was realistic enough to understand that by that point it was so far in train and Sogavare was so intent on doing it. And look, he had a long-standing beef with Australia. This was a bit of payback as well. This was a guy who had his fights going back to John Howard and has been Prime Minister multiple times and had a long-standing beef with John Howard and then therefore the Australian government. And he expressed that in all sorts of colourful ways. And so the deal, I think, was once it was in train and once it was exposed and leaked, it was very clear that they weren't going to be turning back. but the politics certainly was poorly handled by us as a government. How much did that affect the result? I don't think it affected the result in 2022, but it was certainly a bad couple of days. And you don't want to have a bad couple of days in an election campaign, and particularly on an area which is a traditional strength, which is national security. And so it undermined, to some degree, some of those credentials. So, yes, it certainly could have been done in a much better and a more agile fashion. But would that have changed the actual outcome? I doubt it. I very much doubt it, but it certainly would have helped the politics.
So, from what you're saying, these dealing with these matters sound quite complex. I'd like an understanding of. So, what was your team like? Not necessarily this situation, but when you're dealing with a country in the Pacific, when you're planning a government strategy, what does it involve? Who's on your team? What are you doing day to day to kind of get this stuff
Yeah.
done?
Well, you're in an interesting position. See, I was what's known as a minister, but not a cabinet minister. So you had the foreign minister, who's the cabinet minister, and then you sort of sit within that portfolio, but as a full minister, not an assistant minister, which is another level, which I'd also served in a number of capacities. So you don't have as much autonomy in terms of the overall policy development, and some of the big decisions. They're obviously made sometimes at a cabinet level, at that foreign minister level, or in some cases, obviously, at prime ministerial level. And let's face it, more and more decisions these days are centralised. Even if you were to speak to a lot of cabinet ministers, former cabinet ministers probably, who can be a little more honest, they would say that more and more these days, it's the prime minister, the prime minister's office, and maybe a couple of other key ministers around.
Is that a good thing?
No, I don't think so, no. I think it's been a trend, though, for a long time. It was used against Tony Abbott, I think, as a critique. I don't think it significantly changed subsequent to that. And I think it was used against Kevin Rudd with his kitchen cabinet going way back. And I think a lot of people would say the same thing about Anthony Albanese right now, and him having just the sort of 3 or 4 closest confidants who really make most of the decisions. So no, I don't think it is a good thing. I think a big part of how our system's been set up. The good thing about a genuine cabinet process is the checks and balances that provides. That, each of those, and even if, look, let's face it, there's a great differential in the capacity of individuals, and some ministers are policy experts in the field. Most are not. All of them bring, though, different life experiences. Some were very academic, some were very practical, some were farmers, some were small business people. In the Labor Party, obviously unionists and the like, some were lawyers. Whatever it might be, if you're bringing those different worldviews and asking questions in that cabinet process, along with the bureaucracy who are designed to do that, you're far less likely to get, let's say, the policy clangers that come from time to time, the real failings that see, disastrous amounts of money spent or wasted, or people dying, or whatever it might be. So yes, I think it's a bad thing. I think it's a trend. I don't know if it's going to reverse anytime soon. I think it's been a bipartisan trend. And partly, maybe if I were to offer a view, it's probably partly a reflection of the presidential nature of our election campaigns. We focus a lot more now on the individual leaders.
Which I don't think is a good thing. I don't think it's helpful.
It's human nature to some degree to focus on the top dog, so to speak, the head honcho. But that, again, the Westminster system and the cabinet system is meant to take that natural human nature and is meant to still provide checks and balances around that decision making. Because let's face it, there are big egos in politics. And once you've won an election or two, there are some who think they know a lot more than they perhaps do. And they're bigger geniuses than they are. And, there's always a bit of luck. There's always a bit of good management in winning, and there's a bit of good timing that goes into someone winning or losing an election, and hard work and all of those things. But it doesn't mean you're the font of all wisdom. And so it is always better to get a few other eyes for any policy proposals and genuinely test them, which probably goes to the current debate around this hate speech legislation. I mean, how much genuine scrutiny has there been of that legislation when it's being pushed through so quickly? You would argue there's going to be a lot goes wrong if they force that legislation through next week.
No, it's definitely quite a difficult policy to put forward, I think, because it's a noble cause, of course, but the problem is the implications of trying to codify what they want to codify is quite wide ranging, especially when they're not willing to be specific about the certain situations in which they want the legislation to apply. But I think they're trying to do that currently. It's just going to take some time. But speaking of policy proposals and big developments in Australian foreign policy, one that I think hasn't been spoken enough about because I think it's actually probably one of the most significant defense deals we've ever done in the history of this nation is the Puk Puk Treaty with Papua New Guinea, which allows their citizens to join the ADF, and it also provides them a pathway to citizenship.
Mhm.
More importantly, I believe it's if they serve 5 years in the defense forces, that makes them eligible for citizenship. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on this agreement and whether this is a strategy we should be using with more Pacific nations to firmly orbit them in our sphere of influence and fill ranks in the ADF, which are dealing with critical shortages.
Yeah. Look, I certainly think it's largely positive. I think that if you look at PNG, obviously strategically it's of critical importance, just its location, and certainly Australia understands that, the United States understands that. It is strategically positioned to counter potentially threats in our region. And obviously we also have a history of defending our region together and our nation together, most particularly obviously in World War II. So, there are deep ties. We're very different nations, it must be said, but there are deep and lasting ties and a lot of genuine affection. Now, Papua New Guinea is a country I've got a great love for. I only had the limited opportunities to visit as a minister, partly because much of it was during the COVID period, and so travel was just much more limited. But a lot of beautiful people. It's a very young nation, and so it will have a pretty substantial population in years to come, much bigger than other Pacific neighbours. So that's another reason why it becomes strategically more important, not just its location, its landmass, but, it'll soon have a population, I think, bigger than Australia's in the coming decades, certainly. And so that presents opportunities. It also presents challenges because it's still a very poor nation. And so bringing people out of poverty in PNG still needs to be a big part of the focus. But I think closer ties, be they military, economic or otherwise, is definitely part of the answer. And it goes back to that discussion we were having earlier where, we can't counter Chinese influence through corruption because that's just not who we are. But there are a lot of other things we have at our disposal, and certainly those strong historic and cultural links. Now, rugby league, obviously, is another.
That's going to be interesting in NRL team.
Yeah.
I don't know what to say about that, but that just sounds so cool. Just having Papua New Guinea, Australia, and New Zealand in the same NRL comp.
It's one of the only countries. I think it's the only country on earth, really, where you'd say rugby league is the national game.
Yeah.
In Australia, you could say it's sort of the New South Wales or the Queensland game, but it's not the national game as such. And in Northern England, it's very popular and the like. But certainly in Papua New Guinea, it is the national game, and a lot of talent out there. We see a lot of that in the NRL at the moment. So look, this will be a great source of pride for them. I hope it leads to bigger and better things, because ultimately we want that relationship to evolve. Australia will continue to be a really important partner, but we want genuine economic development, self-sufficiency as much as possible in PNG, which I think will serve both of our countries well.
So speaking about global issues and how they're affecting Australia, where increasingly you hear people say the next big war is going to be happening soon. I wasn't alive in the 80s or the 90s. I'm sure people back then were saying the Soviet Union and the US were going to kick things off.
Yeah.
It didn't happen. But nevertheless, Australia needs to always be prepared if the worst were to occur, a global war, or at least a war of significance that we were involved in. You were a minister in the government, obviously, so you would have had a good idea about what our current defense capabilities are. You weren't the minister for the region, but being a minister in the government, I'm sure you'd be privy to details that me, ordinary citizen, didn't know. How prepared do you think we are currently to fight a defensive war?
I think there's a long way to go, to be honest. And I mean, I think there are some good things that have happened. I do think AUKUS has great potential, and I think it is a legacy item of the last coalition government, to build that deeper cooperation and to ultimately bring extraordinary capability to the Australian Defence Force with nuclear-powered subs. So I think in that long run, in that medium to long run, as those submarines come on board, I think that will be very positive. There are obviously some gaps at the moment, and they need to be filled pretty quickly. I think some of the missile technology, I think we need to be acquiring more of that defensive capability with longer range. I think drones and other more recent technological advances that we've seen utilised overseas, particularly in Ukraine, that has implications and potentially positive implications for Australia in fighting a defensive war, because drone technology, we actually have a lot of that is developed by Australia, by Australian companies.
Drone Shield, I think.
Yeah,
Is
and there's a number of others,
yeah.
and I got to know some of these. Some of those are in my region in Canberra. There's some really great defence industry, but a lot of it hasn't yet been adopted as quickly as it could. I think the procurement process in the Australian Defence Force is far too slow. We see it obviously with frigates and other things. We need to bring some of these things on board much quicker. I think that was the thinking if you go back to the early years when Tony Abbott was going to buy off-the-shelf submarines from the Japanese. I think that was the thinking, get them quickly. Then it became a debate, a battle over, about industry policy and are we building the submarines in South Australia and other things. I think that slowed us down. It hasn't been the only thing that slowed us down. There's been a lot of other factors. We also are spending a lot more of our overall budget on other things. We are spending a lot more of our budget on welfare than we ever have. We're spending a lot more on health, and we're spending a lot more now on the NDIS as well, and growing at a very rapid rate. Everyone acknowledges you need to slow that down, but will it happen? Well, it needs to happen, and one of the reasons it needs to happen, we need to try and balance budgets, but we also will need to put resources into defence. And defence is one of those things where in peacetime, everyone, gets complacent and are happy to sort of spend it on other things. But ultimately, you need to be ready. I think our fuel supply, our strategic fuel reserve, and not just strategic fuel reserve, which isn't good enough at the moment, but we should have, and this is where you get into this clash over policies and free market versus a bit of government intervention. We should have more refining capacity than we do in this country, because you can't just rely on a strategic reserve. You need to be able to refine that product, and we should be still developing more of our resources as well as a country, and that brings us greater sovereignty. In the short term, I think there are some gaps, and I think if you were the Defence Minister now, you'd be desperately looking at what you can purchase in the immediate or in the next year, 6 months, 2 years, 18 months, that will deter an enemy whilst you acquire that longer term, much more expensive capacity that's coming with things like AUKUS and other acquisitions.
Well, I think that a lot of that, what you've been talking about here, we've heard about repeatedly on the news, but it seems governments still seem to be unwilling to invest what needs to be needed and what the experts are telling us. But hopefully that changes. So we've talked about a lot of things today, a lot about your past, a lot about life-changing events, but I'd like to finish today on something that's happened to you recently. You had a major heart surgery, if I'm correct, and I'd like to know, how does that change your perspective on life, having something like that happen to you? And
yeah, look, it's all fairly recent. 8 weeks ago, I had open heart surgery, and it was because of a congenital problem with a valve in my heart. I was born with a dodgy valve, basically, that needed to be replaced. It sort of didn't affect me for really all of my life, but the scans were showing that we needed to replace it. So, yeah, major surgery, open heart, 8 weeks ago, feeling pretty good, all things considered. So recovering really well, and amazing surgeons and doctors and nurses and others at the Mater Hospital. So very, very grateful to them. Look, it does change your perspective a little bit, because you are, whilst they can tell you that you're only a 1% chance or less of death when you go in for a major surgery like that, anyone who's probably been through it knows that 1% doesn't give you a whole lot of comfort when they're about to slash your chest open. You're facing sort of your maker, in a sense. You are faced with your mortality in a real sense that in day-to-day life we don't tend to face. So it is different. I feel probably more positive about life going forward. I feel like a little bit more of a new lease on life. I appreciate even more my family, recently becoming a granddad, all of the blessings that I have. I'm very grateful. I've been a very, very lucky person. A lot of what we get in life is undeserved, good or bad. And we can work hard, we can do our best, try and be good people, but some people get really bad luck, some people get a lot of good fortune, and I've probably had more than my share of good fortune in life. Great family, great friends, great opportunities in life, and a lot of that is from my forebears and this country and so many other things outside of my control. So more of a desire to think about what the next 10 or 15 or 20 years of working life looks like. I'm involved with a couple of charities. I'd like to probably do more of that. And I'd like to run a marathon in the next 12 months. I know a half marathon in the past. So I've got some plans to sort of make the most of my relative good health, because when you sort of lose it even for a little while, you certainly appreciate it a lot more.
Said you've been a minister, you've been a senator, you've been the leader of the ACT Liberal Party in the local assembly, and you've been a father, a grandfather, a husband. So you've lived a lot of life. So a lot of my listeners are young people, and I'd like to know before we end the podcast today, what's one word of advice you'd give to them?
That's a good question. This is a question without notice, guys. So bear with me while I think about a good response. Um, I would say work out the big questions before you work out the little questions. The meaning of life, we're all searching for that. For me, my faith is a big part of who I am. I don't shove it down other people's throats. I understand a lot of people don't share my Christian faith, my Catholic faith, but ultimately we all have to make decisions about what's the most meaningful thing in the world, and is there anything after this world? And I think everything else sort of flows from that worldview. So I would say listen, learn, read a lot, think, debate before you settle in what you believe, so that you own it, and then try and live it out to your absolute best ability. Um, for me, the best expression of that is family. And so, I would encourage people, think about family earlier than you're ready for it. Don't think that your 20s is just a time to drift, and figure out what you want to do when you're 35 or 40. You can actually be making decisions at a much younger age about life, about career, about family. All of those are really, really important things, and about those worldview questions and what means things to you, and then try and live it out, and live it out to the best of your ability in an authentic way, in keeping with what you believe. That would be my best advice to a young person making their way through the world. And don't think that everything that your parents and grandparents think is outdated or stupid, because there is some wisdom in what has gone before. That doesn't mean you do everything exactly the same, but you certainly learn a lot from what's gone before.
Well, it's been a pleasure having you on the podcast today, Zed, and I hope you have a lovely rest of the day.
Thank you, mate. Great being with you.